What's up, A Push Nation? And for this important fireside chat, I felt I had to be outside on this glorious January Wednesday afternoon. The topic for this evening's fireside chat is a big one. We're talking about the buildup, causes, and some early strategies involved in the Civil War. So buckle up. This is going to be a lengthy fireside chat that really hits upon these topics. And I'm going to start with causes. We've talked in class a great deal about the run-up and seminal sectionalism moments. So I'm just going to recap these quickly, but harp on something that was immediate. So if you look at the entire antebellum period of American history, we looked at causes of the Civil War, some more short-term than others that were more long-term. So I'm going to recap some of these. First of all, we had the economies, the economic differences between North and South. That was driven by some of the tariffs and the policies that were created by Congress that further drove a wedge between the two sides. But at the core of that tariff issue was a difference in plantation economy versus more manufacturing economy. And so those were important differences. Manifest Destiny was a long-term cause because as slavery spread into new territories, that heightened suspicions and that raised anxiety levels amongst policymakers. With Manifest Destiny came the Mexican-American War. We talked about how that was a major turning point because of all that land that came with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So Manifest Destiny, the Mexican-American War, definitely major players in sectionalism and driving North and South towards a civil war. Poor leadership, right? We had Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan there, the 1850s presidents who did very little to exacerbate any of the issues and alleviate any of the problems that were moving towards the Civil War. You got the Dred Scott decision that definitely raised suspicions and forced more Northerners over into the Republican Party. As a result of that decision, it really drove a wedge. You also had issues like Bleeding Kansas. But of course, no matter what anyone tells you, the overarching driving influence towards the Civil War was slavery. And that narrative that somehow slavery was not the true cause. You can talk about states' rights, you can talk about sectionalism, economic differences, but slavery was a driving cause of the Civil War, but more of a long-term cause because slavery had been in existence in the United States since the inception and the introduction of the Constitution. But what was it that truly drove North and South towards the bloodiest conflict in American history? And that was, no doubt, the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln, who had really been relatively unknown prior to the election of the Illinois Senate, where he and Stephen Douglas had their infamous Lincoln-Douglas debates over issues such as slavery, the extension of slavery into new territories. Abraham Lincoln burst onto the national scene in that Illinois Senate election, which he lost. And we heard about that as a seminal sectionalism moment. Abraham Lincoln lost that election, but yet that loss propelled him to national victory in 1860. Why did Lincoln's election trigger the Civil War is a fascinating question, one that could easily come up on an A-Push multiple choice or be embedded in an SAQ on causes of the Civil War. Well, you have to take a look at the electoral map because what the electoral map reveals is what the South was suspicious about when the issue of representation was first tabled at the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s. Lincoln did not receive a single, not one electoral college vote from a southern state, not one. And because of the balance of population and how the population of the United States at the time was more geared towards the northern states and the Midwestern states that were above the 36-30 line and had become free states, with free states overwhelmingly choosing Lincoln, no matter who Southerners voted for in that election, whether it be one of the other Democratic candidates that opposed Lincoln as the Republican candidate. The Whigs, by the way, were gone in 1856. So Lincoln will be the first Republican president in American history. But nonetheless, the Southern states felt a sense of futility in this election. And it truly aroused their anger because Lincoln wins and comes to the executive house in Washington without one single Southern state's vote. And for many states, that was the final straw. In fact, South Carolina would be the first state to break away from the Union shortly after, within a month or so of Abraham Lincoln's election. Now, keep in mind the timeline here. When the president was elected in November, Lincoln didn't come to office until March 4th, 1861. And by then, as you can see here on this graphic, by then, so many southern states had already broken away. South Carolina being the first, and many states would follow shortly after, with ultimately Virginia being one of the last states to join the Confederacy. Lincoln's election and his ensuing inauguration speech, though, is really powerful primary source material. And I'm going to flash this up on the screen now for you to see, but it really highlights how Lincoln was putting the sort of decision to avoid war in the hands of the Southerners. And Lincoln knew at this point that there really was very little he could do at all over the issue of states leaving. The logic of Confederate states leaving is a fascinating point I want to raise because it goes back to some continuities we've learned already this year. Earlier this year, we talked about two moments where state governments raised major concerns with the handling of the federal government. The first was back in John Adams's presidency when John Adams and Congress pushed to pass the Alien and Sedition Act, which really cracked down on free speech against the Federalist Party by Democratic Republicans. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, two leaders of the Dem Rep Party, wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, where they argued that, with their logic being that since the states all adopted and ratified the Constitution, the states could in turn then void any federal law. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions ultimately served as a motivating argument in another historical continuity, which was the Tariff of Abominations, when South Carolina and John C. Calhoun, who was then vice president, argued that the tariff could be abolished and not followed by the southern states in the 1820s because, again, they used that nullification theory that if the states have approved the Constitution, then they have the right to nullify any federal action. South Carolina being the first state to break away, once again, that makes a lot of sense given that South Carolina was in the thick of the nullification crisis with the Tariff of Abominations in 1828 and 1832, where eventually Andrew Jackson threatened to send troops to keep South Carolina in its place. But in this case, Lincoln did not threaten to send troops because Lincoln was not president when South Carolina broke away. James Buchanan was still in the White House. As those states broke away, though, a fascinating reality struck the southern states. They had to form a new government. And so what we get is the CSA, Confederate States of America. There was no precedent for this. So what you end up getting is the Confederates had to write their own constitution. The Confederates had to form their own government. They had to elect officials. Jefferson Davis, by the way, was the first elected president, with Alexander Stephens being the vice president. They had to create their own currency, their own post office, everything from scratch. There was no turning back. There was no acceptance into the Union. And a little dinner party knowledge here, there were in total 3 capitals of the Confederacy. The first was in Montgomery, Alabama. Then it was moved to Richmond, Virginia. But when Richmond fell at the end of the war, it went to Danville, Virginia for about 8 days before the war ended. So 3 Confederate capitals for you to be aware of. Let's talk now, however, about strengths and weaknesses, because as the Confederacy was forming and as it looked like the Union and the Confederacy were heading towards war in early 1861, both sides had strengths and weaknesses. The Union strengths were its industrial economy. There's no doubt that having the bulk of America's factories in northern states would provide a long-term advantage for the Union. In terms of manufacturing weapons, in terms of manufacturing war materials, the North had a decisive advantage in that department over the South. The North also had a decisive advantage in terms of its technology development, like railroads. Railroads were just starting to become popularized in America in the 1850s and 1860s, and the vast majority of railroads ran through northern states. Critical advantage for the North. We'll get into more of that later in class. The North also had a larger population, so more soldiers, which meant that they could in turn recruit and draft, because both sides, North and South, had conscription laws passed where people were required by law to report for military duty. In the North, for example, conscription There were outs that you could pay your way out. So wealthy people could afford to pay their way out, but you could also find a replacement. So you could get someone to take your spot if you were drafted. The Confederacy, too, had a draft as well. I should mention that. The North also had one other advantage that I want to bring to your attention, which is just the government infrastructure. But the South had to create a government from scratch. The North already had a government in place. So that would be a decisive advantage for the North as well. In the South, though, they did have some advantages early on, and this would help them stay in the fight longer than anyone expected. More on that in a bit. First and foremost, the majority of the war was fought in the South. The Confederate Army only invaded the North twice, once at the Battle of Antietam here in Maryland, and the other at Gettysburg. Other than that, most of the fights were in the South and in the Midwest along the Mississippi River Valley, which were Confederate territories. So for the South, it was more of a home field advantage, which we talked about how important that was in the Revolutionary War. Another Southern advantage is foreign allies. At the very beginning of the war, France and England, there was major talks that the Confederacy was going to bring France and England into the war on the side of the Confederacy. One of the reasons the European powers might jump on the side of the South was cotton, because the South was providing cotton for France and for England for many decades now. So there was an economic relationship that the Southerners had with European powers. But arguably, the key strength that the South had early in the war was military leadership. Some of the best generals in the United States Army seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, A.P. Hill, James Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson, George Pickett, P.T. Beauregard. These were some of the most famous generals of their era. And that gave the South, especially under Robert E. Lee's command, one of the true advantages that they utilized. So, with both sides comparing their strengths and weaknesses a little bit, let's talk now about how the war broke out. So, the war started with the shelling, the Confederate shelling at a South Carolina Union occupied fort called Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter was where the first shots of the war were fired on April 12th, 14th, April 12th to April 14th, right around that time frame, 1861. So just about a month into Lincoln's presidency, Confederate ships fired upon a Union fort. Nobody was killed. A horse died, unfortunately. A horse died, but this was the first shots of the war. And so Lincoln now knows that the Confederates have passed the point of no return. And at this stage now, both North and South are going to gear up for major military campaigns. Wars and armies don't fight overnight, and they don't form overnight. So there was a process between the Battle of Fort Sumter, if you want to call it a battle, to the very first land battle of the war, which took place about an hour or so from Bullis in Manassas, Virginia, which is the first battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. This is the only battle I'm going to talk about on this fireside chat because I want to make sure you guys are aware about one of the more unique aspects of this battle. First and foremost, it was a decisive Confederate victory. The Confederates won this brutal battle. And like many of the battles of the Civil War, an important theme that my 8th grade history teacher, Mr. Paul, shout out to him, he was a great teacher. Mr. Paul taught us about the Civil War, that the technology was ahead of the tactics. Cannons, artillery, high-powered rifles, these were important military tools, but yet the tactics of just charging into your enemy and seeing who could stand was the same way wars have been fought since basically the Revolution. And that was still the tactic of the day. And people just got slaughtered. The first Battle of Bull Run was a harbinger, a really nasty, vicious battle. In pop culture, one of the defining memories of this Confederate victory was the fact that, for many Americans, they were unaware of the carnage that was about to be unleashed. Both sides combined lost almost 1,000 men at this first battle of the war. Actually, newspaper reports and eyewitness reports from this battle that people coming out from the surrounding towns in Manassas picnicked on hills and watched the battle take place. It's kind of a creepy, eerie moment, but it's a reminder that the popular idea was that this conflict between North and South would not last. And most Americans believed it would be over by Christmas. And boy, were they wrong, because this is a war that would, by the end, would cost millions of lives. from here, it's going to be an all-out war of attrition. The United States and the Confederate States will break into a total war philosophy. Their entire economies, their entire governments will be geared towards winning the war at all costs. And I'm going to end the fireside chat with one more bit for you. Union strategy. Lincoln turned over the Union plans to a General Winfield Scott, who had been a hero of the Mexican-American War. And Winfield Scott was not a battlefield commander at this stage in his life. He was too rotund, too old to command troops on the battlefield, but he's a brilliant strategist. And Scott came up with a plan known as the Anaconda Plan. And it was a brilliant plan that the North would try to execute in the war. The first part of the plan was to blockade the South. The North had a decisive technological advantage, and they used that in terms of their Navy. The South, which did have a Navy, although smaller, would have trouble running the Union blockade. So Scott and the Navy positioned ships and tried to stymie any European imports coming into the South. They tried to disrupt the Southerners' trade, and that was a key part of the Union strategy. The second part was that Scott had suggested that the North was going to take the Mississippi River. By taking the Mississippi River, this would cut off Midwestern Confederate states and Texas. So taking the Mississippi was a critical goal of the North, and eventually that would happen on July 4th, 1863, when the North would take and win the Battle of Vicksburg, led by Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, Vicksburg was the same day as the Battle of Gettysburg. Talk about a decisive Northern turning point in the war in 1863. So the Mississippi would eventually be captured. And then the third part of the strategy was to take Richmond, since that was the capital of the South, the second capital of the South. And the Union would eventually do that as well. So Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan proved to be a long-term success. But in the immediate years of the war, 1861, 1862, the Confederates are going to run the table. And the Confederates are going to overwhelm the North and come perilously close to invading Washington, D.C. at the Battle of Antietam. My plan moving forward out of National History Day is going to be for us to really dive into some of these battles and do like sort of a one-day battlefield tour type of situation where we talk about the leadership, we talk about the strategy. I do want to dedicate one day to that, and then we'll talk about the cultural impact of the war. But for Friday's Fireside Chat quiz for my APUSH Nation class, you may use open notes. I know this was a longer one, so thanks for your patience here for these last 20 minutes. I've enjoyed this as I'm enjoying this gorgeous day on our Bolas campus. So I'll end my video as always, APUSH Nation. Remember, the past shapes the future. Take care, APUSH Nation. Have a great evening.